Good morning. Good morning. We have two amendments to go through fairly quickly, and then we have an amendment at 11:30 from another member. And then we're going to spend the morning with Professor Colby talking more about foundation formulas, and then some time with Julia Richter on the changes to the property tax credit homestead exemption. The first, I don't have my agenda in front of me, so I'm just winging it here. So first amendment that we have is, we're going to start with one that I'm offering. How's that sound? Tucker's not here. We're just gonna do it anyway. You want to tell us about it, or would you like me to tell us about it?
You can go ahead, you did.
Great.
You did the work.
I didn't do any work, Tucker did the work. So an amendment to the flooding bill, which is
97.
97. Which should be up on our committee page, maybe. Will soon be up on our committee page. When we changed the distribution of the local option tax from 80-20 to 75-25. Does everyone remember that fun work we did? There were some towns that have local option tax distribution in their charters. And so those towns, unless we supersede their charters, that's not the right legal word, but unless we sort of comment on their charters, those communities would just still wind up with the 80-20. And so it's what? 70-30, thank you. So it's to make sure that the charters are sort of encompassed in the switch to the 75-25. And that will be up on our committee page any minute, but I'll wait for it to be up on the committee page before we vote so people can look at it. And then the second amendment that we're working on is an amendment to the housing bill from the Appropriations Committee. Would you join us and talk to us about it? What, is that you?
I can certainly talk about
Okay.
the appropriation changes,
Okay.
and then I think Cameron would probably talk about the amendment itself.
Whichever you all want to do.
It's good work.
Morning,
Morning.
Cameron Wood, Office of Legislative Counsel. I was just trying to pull up to see if the amendment is on your committee page or not. Be happy to share my screen. It looks like it is on your committee page. Yes, it is under my name for today.
Delightful.
Okay, so I don't have the Zoom link, so I'm not going to share my screen. The amendment is very straightforward. So if you just, follow along, what the Appropriations Committee is doing here that you all agreed to yesterday is to substitute their amendment for your amendment. The reason that I had to draft it that way is because if you all recall, your amendment was putting a sunset on the tax credits. That was one of the primary pieces of your amendment.
Yeah.
3 of the 4 instances of your amendment were to get to that purpose. The Appropriations Committee was removing all appropriations and tax implications from the bill. So because they were doing that, I would have had to go in and strike instances of your amendment, renumber some of them, add additional amendments, and it just started in my head get really messy about how it would be phrased. So I worked with your House clerk, and her and I came up with the solution of just recommending the substitute amendment. That would be the easiest, most straightforward way to get at what that committee was recommending to do. So what they have done is, again, they are simply stripping out all of the appropriations from the bill. In the first instance of amendment that they have, there was an appropriation to the design committee, and they stripped that out and they added a subsection to say that the per diems would be available if they were funded in FY26. The second instance of amendment was removing the tax credit section entirely. The third instance of amendment was to remove the section related to the municipal 1% tax on short-term rentals. That was in your amendment from this committee. They wanted to keep that. And finally, the last three amendments are removing an appropriation from a report. There was the off-site housing construction report that Vermont Housing Finance Agency was required to do, and they were given $250,000 for that. They're stripping that out and then adding a section to say, you, VHFA, aren't required to do this report in the event that it's not funded in the budget. And then the last instance of amendment is simply removing all the remainder appropriations. So.
And folks, this was on the floor yesterday and we voted on it yesterday. We just forgot to, it's sort of standard procedure to move the stuff out of the bill into the big bill. And so we forgot to struggle with. Sorry about that.
Just, Cam, what I wanted, without looking through right now the whole budget and I did not do this yesterday, to make sure that those appropriations live in the budget, that we're just stripping it out of this vehicle.
So some of the appropriations made it and some did not. And JFO has a great chart to reflect what made it, what did not make it. For this committee's purposes, the tax credits did not make it.
The $250,000 for
The two tax,
generation home buyer.
and then there was the extension of the
The
down payment assistance.
Yes.
Those did not make it in the final budget. So. You're welcome.
Those were for VHFA, right?
Yes. And I think let's have James join us for that, for the numbers part. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Morning, for the record, James Duffy, Joint Fiscal Office. So posted on the Ways and Means Committee page should be a document titled JFO Crosswalk. That will show the committee what appropriations did and did not make it into the big bill from H479. I'm going to pull those up behind me as I speak here. And as Cameron already mentioned, in addition to appropriations that were removed from the bill, both VHFA affordable housing tax credit programs were also removed from H479 via the hack amendment. Now, I'm not able to share my screen. There we go. But just for reference, this is.
It's not.
For reference, the table behind me is the crosswalk that I mentioned. So going left to right, you can see the corresponding. Oh, I'm sorry. This is actually the floor tabs over here. No, I'm sorry. This is actually the crosswalk to the GovRec as opposed to the big bill. Great. This is the crosswalk between H479 and the big bill. So moving left to right, you can see H479 appropriation and the big bill appropriation. That column difference in appropriations tells you.
Can you make that bigger?
Yes, yes, I can. That'd be great. And then just as a shorthand, the far right column tell you in plain English what appropriations were not included and what appropriations were included in the big bill, but at a reduced level. This table is strictly appropriations, so you won't see the tax credits mentioned, but I will just emphasize that they are not included in the big bill as introduced.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I guess, yeah, it doesn't, the other stuff is not our germane, so domain. Not germane.
Germane to our domain.
Just surprised by the absence, and I'm sorry I didn't catch it in the big bill yesterday.
So,
Yeah.
that means those, are gone completely. They're not moved anywhere else.
I understand that there are a great deal of tax credits in a housing economic development bill coming over from the Senate that we are going to spend some time on.
Okay.
So I don't think that that conversation is closed.
Thank you.
Yes. Anything else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Folks, I think we need to straw poll that appropriations amendment. We can wait to do that until we can do all of our straw polls at the end of our morning, or we could do it now. Does anyone have preferences? You need some, you're good? Okay.
Fine.
Okay, all those in favor of the appropriations amendment, raise your hand. All those opposed? You're opposed. Okay,
So the straw poll is 10-1-0.
yes. You got that?
10-1-0.
Okay, great. Great, okay, so we have covered 493. Sorry, not 493.
479.
479. Sorry, there were a lot of last minute agenda changes this morning. So we have covered 479. We are going to do 397 after the rest of our testimony. And have you been able to post my amendment? Great. If folks want to spend a moment looking at that.
Right.
Great. My refresh button doesn't work anymore the way it used to. I have to like go out and go back in again. It's really a shame.
Oh.
So we can have Tucker come up and explain this if folks would rather. But it's essentially saying that regardless of someone's charter, this counts too. And Tucker sort of considered it, it's definitely more than a technical amendment, but it was sort of a mistake that it was not included the first time, an oversight, I guess I would say.
Straw poll.
Also, Matt Byron is bringing a new title for a section to this bill. Still has too many amendments and it's embarrassing. I just want to say that on the record.
So is
Yes.
Thank you.
GovOps going to take a position on this amendment as well?
Yes, they are.
Okay,
Patty's going to go talk about it.
okay.
Would folks rather wait on this for Patty to go talk to GovOps about it and then we'll vote? Do folks want to vote now?
I don't understand the reasons that we're doing this.
Oh, okay. So generally, would you like Tucker to explain or would you like me to explain? Would you prefer Tucker explain? Is that what you're nodding?
Tucker would be,
Okay, great. We will have Tucker explain. Okay. Thank you. Okay, we will,
Oh, he's not in here.
he's not, that's okay.
Now I want you.
So local option tax statute that sits in the green books
Mhm.
had one ratio. We changed that ratio. But we missed the fact that for whatever reason, my guess is something related to Act 60, some charters have their local option to have the local option tax distribution in their charters as well. And we forgot to include the language that said that statute sort of supersedes local charter language. If we don't pass this amendment, then some communities will still have the 80-20 split instead of the Better for Towns 75-25 split. I did it wrong again.
Yeah, 70-30.
70-30, not 75-25. I just want to apologize between my cold and I love you so much, Elle, but Sorsha is like an extension of my brain. I'm like very scattered this morning. I'm sorry. Yes,
So is this part of what Representative Sibilia was referring to?
no,
And that's-
Representative Sibilia has a whole other journey she is on, yes. It doesn't seem to be offering an amendment related to it. So who knows what will happen?
So I get the point on this, but I know that both the city of Rutland and the city of Burlington have the ability in their charters to establish a different local options tax aside from the state local options tax. I'm just wondering if that's not affected by this because they're not collected by the state. I just don't know if there are any other instances in which a local option tax is somehow affected by this aside from the city of Burlington.
So let's wait for Tucker.
Great.
Okay, great.
So, not to confuse things, but, I was trying to understand what Representative Sibilia was referencing, and is that the particular piece in there that talks about the remaining amount of taxes reported shall be remitted monthly to the state treasurer for deposit in the pilot special fund? Is that?
So my understanding of Representative Sibilia's concern, and I feel very nervous speaking for Representative Sibilia, but my understanding of what her concern is that because of the increase in local option taxes over the last few years, we've wound up with a surplus in the fund. That's one of the reasons that we decided to change the ratio going forward. She wants the surplus that's currently sitting in the fund to be sent back to the municipalities.
And that's that 10 million?
Yes, it'll be a little less than that, but yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And Representative Parsons' amendment, which is coming later, is that he doesn't even think we should change the ratio because he thinks we need to spend the pilot special fund to actually increase pilot payments. So both sides. I think we've found a middle. Sure.
Returning,
Also don't want to speak for Representative Parsons.
right, that returning the 10 million back to the towns is the subject of one of the bills on our wall.
Oh, is it?
Was one.
Which one?
I don't know. There was one.
One of those.
One of those.
The original short form bill that I had, that switched
Oh.
to 80/20, sent it back to towns, and did one other thing.
Huh, Representative Wassezak's bill.
From like forever ago.
Well, see, I remember there was.
And maybe when we're done with our education transformation language, we can spend time diving deeper into pilot together.
We do have a fiscal note, which Representative Wassezak referred to yesterday on the floor, which is really helpful in looking at how much we're anticipating the impact to be by going to 75-25.
And the fiscal note points out that even going to 75-25 and doing the municipal grand list stabilization program, the fund will continue to accumulate a surplus. So we're not touching the existing surplus for anything that's in 397.
And I don't know if this is in the fiscal note or not, because I've read too many fiscal notes in the last yesterday, but this is only the second year that we have fully paid pilot payments. Because there's never been enough money in the fund before. So it seems to me that maybe we should just like, let it just like chill for a little bit and make sure we're fulfilling our existing obligations. That is my technical term to be like that.
Why has it never been full before?
There hasn't been enough money in the fund.
Or can be here in 5.
Oh, that's great. No, I'm also totally scattered and not doing a very good job. What is your question?
But Chair, I can't find Teddy's the fiscal note that he just referenced.
Oh, it's around somewhere.
Yeah, H397, it's under the bill page. If you look at H397 under bills, and then you'll see Chris Roop, fiscal note, about 2/3 of the way down the page.
Thank you, Jared.
I always go to fiscal information tab.
Yeah, if you go to fiscal.
You can do that too.
Fiscal audit, and you just put in the number of the bill at the upper right-hand corner, it's so much easier.
Do that too.
Go to the website, join fiscal office, website, put the bill number in the upper right-hand corner, it's done, it comes out.
And if folks also want to take a moment while we wait for Tucker, There is an entire issue brief on pilots from Ted
Yes.
that is available on the JFO website.
You put issue brief from Ted on that.
Elle, I wonder if you could find that issue brief from Ted on the JFO website and send it to all of us. Thank you.
I'm just saying, it's hard to know where everything is on.
Yes, I imagine you could put pilot in the search box. That would be better than Ted.
Friendly.
That was the best.
Oh, a very office moment.
It was off. That was off. Who says this isn't fun? Who?
We're gonna Ted in the box.
Right. What am I?
Not welcome.
Not that we're not having CP2.
Just for that.
Or H2.
Thank you. You can't just do health ways and means? Oh. I didn't know that different people have different permissions or different lists. What a
Oh, we
fun
sure do.
little piece of IT governance. Thank you.
She doesn't have access to send it to the ways and means list.
I thought it was something to find something on the Ways and Means website. I mean, on the, never mind. I thought it was a website hint, so.
Sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could post the fiscal brief on the issue brief, thank you.
Oh, there it is.
I'm very sorry, Professor Colby, for the wait.
Lots of problems. I mean, how? We do not like what's happening in Oklahoma. Apparently, I was just. Sorry. Thank you for staying on it. It's like a glimpse into the future.
Yes. Your coordinator. In, on page, I'm looking at the amendments, so page 3. Line,
We'll be here in just a moment. to make a
Okay.
Better situated to answer.
all right, it still has a 70% in there. But I'm not sure if the way the 70% is referenced, if it's okay to leave it in there, or whether that needs to be changed to 70.
We'll find out when Tupper lives. Need to delay action on third reading or only on second?
Do we have to do this now? Could we do this at 7:30?
Well, Tucker's on his way. Carol, do you know if you can delay action on third reading or only on second reading?
Well, we don't meet till 1, right? Days, yeah.
Yes, but do you know the answer to that question?
Can we delay third reading? Probably. I can find out. I shall find out
Thank you
immediately.
very much.
I think so.
Point of order.
Please join us.
Yes.
Thank you. Tucker, do you feel that perhaps the scale of amendments to this bill have gotten a bit out of control and we maybe need a strike off?
That would be another amendment that I'd be drafting. So in that case, no. No comment.
Okay.
Finding out.
Thank you.
So while you pull it up for yourself, are you able to tell us about why we are doing this? I sort of explained the background around the charters and that we want to make sure that this applies to everyone and not just the folks who don't happen to have this language in their charters, but I wonder if you could add a few more words to that.
Yes, just making sure that I had to do this first. For the record, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Counsel. So I believe you're talking about the amendment to H 397 introduced by you and Representative Wozniak.
Thank you.
So the purpose here is to bring the charters of 4 municipalities into conformity with the new pilot 75-25 split. So yesterday I was following Tucker's #1 rule of working in municipal law, which is always be checking charters. And I searched for 70% in the LexisNexis database in Title 24 appendix, and 4 municipalities popped up as having specified in the text of their charter that they will receive 70% of the share of the taxes collected from their municipality. And that was Burlington, Montpelier, Middlebury, and Williston. There were a few others that were very crafty, including the town of Montgomery, where it says that they shall receive not less than 70% of the share allotted to them pursuant to 24 VSA section 138. So they're okay because they just set themselves a floor and said, we're going to get 70 or more, but not less. So the purpose of this amendment is to ensure that for Burlington, Montpelier, Middlebury, and Williston, that those 4 municipalities will be able to take advantage of the new proposed 75-25 split. And the legal reasoning here, charters are special law. They apply to 1 municipality, and based on the canons of legislative interpretation, they control on any instance where there's inconsistency between the charter language and the general law. So without these amendments, these municipalities would only get 70%. They would not get 75%. The language is very specific. So each section of the amendment here goes into municipal charters. The first is Burlington in section, what is section 14 here, but it's really the first instance of amendment. And it strikes out any language that references the 70-30 split for the revenue share, but also for the costs that are allotted for the per return fee to the Department of Taxes, and ties the language directly to 24 VSA section 138. Section 14A does the same for the city of Montpelier, eliminating references to 70%. Section 14B, that is the town of Middlebury, again tying to the general law, eliminating the reference to 70%. And finally, 14C, that's for the town of Williston, tying each reference where there would have been some constraint to the general law. There is a risk to tying to 24 VSA 138 instead of specifying the percentage, which is if a future General Assembly lowers the allotment, you're tied to the general law and your revenue share is going to go down, which is why Montgomery gets credit for being so crafty in setting the 70% floor. But, you know, there's also obviously a risk in having a specific percentage in your charter because it doesn't guarantee that a General Assembly in the future will be so thoughtful as to amend your charter to make sure that you can take advantage of the increased revenue when 24 V, say 138 is amended to increase.
So the forward thinking wasn't, which town was it?
Town of Montgomery.
Forward thinking Montgomery. These other places, they could adopt, they could do a charter change and then they would be protected in the future, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Montgomery did many, many interesting things. I remember that charter very well, but the 70% floor was curious. It was tied to a specific infrastructure project and the life of the local option tax and the infrastructure project is complete.
And to add to that, I believe, Tucker, they've got issues with that infrastructure.
Yes.
Know about issues.
Representative Burkhart.
So I had a question, Tucker, on page 3, there is still, and it may not matter because it says, for section 14C, line 19, where it talks about if the local options tax is repealed or the 70% allocation is reduced. So I don't know that it necessarily matters whether that should be 75 now that we're going to 75, or whether that's just going to lead to us having to change it again if we go to 80-20 or make some other change. So I just wanted to raise it. That was left in there on purpose as 70%.
Yeah, I didn't change it because it's triggering language that Williston included in their charter at the time that the local option tax was adopted. Maybe in the green books, we could put a note in just saying that the 70% allocation has changed, but that this language was, you know, a contingency for this, the effectiveness of this local option tax in the town. I didn't want to change it yesterday, not knowing if I would reset their contingency date by changing this language, so.
Tucker, there's, according to what I had read before, that the city of Burlington and city of Rutland also have the ability to charge something besides the local options tax. I thought it was a 2% that they could charge on sales that exists in Burlington and Rutland. That's not the LOT specifically.
I would have to connect with you offline to get some more details about what you might be referencing. The section that's included here for the city of Burlington is their local option sales tax.
Yeah.
I'm not certain. I know that they have additional taxes, marketplace, for example. And the city of Rutland also does have a downtown district tax, which might be additional to the local option tax, but let's chat offline and then I can do some research for you to let you know if there is something additional. South Burlington proposed a 2% local option tax 3 years ago, but it didn't pass through the General Assembly.
Right, yes. Okay, I thought it was part of their charter that they could, all right, we'll connect offline, thank you.
It also might be Rutland Town.
To hear the answer online, because it's been brought up now more than once in this committee, and I want to be sure that the public knows the answer.
I can certainly come back to answer online as well if that's what the committee wants. I just don't want to do any
Yep. I should have said that.
live research.
Yeah.
We don't want you to do live research, only dead research.
It's,
Does anyone have any other questions about this amendment or need to hear from anyone else? Great. Thank you very much, Tucker.
thank you all.
Mark's just protecting his back. He's not trying to help you all up.
He's always done that.
Wait, Jim, hitting again.
Okay. Can someone make a motion on the amendment?
I would move that we find the amendments to H 397 offered by Representative Kornheiser and Wazzaq favorable.
So move. Thank you so much for that. Representative Kimball move that we find the amendment, Kornheiser amendment, Kornheiser Wazzaq amendment favorable. Any discussion?
Do you need a step?
No. Is there any discussion? Sorry, the coughed up in the mouth are not working very well.
Not my.
Any discussion on the amendment?
All discussion.
Great. Seeing no discussion, if the clerk could please call the roll.
I find the roll or is it?
The straw poll.
Oh.
All those in favor? All those opposed? I see no opposed. I see 11-0. Thank you, everyone. Representative Wazzaq, have you recorded that vote? On the floor? Wonderful. Okay,
Chair Kornheiser, are you talking about this on the floor?
sure.
Okay.
I'd love you to. That would be great. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here with us, Chris, through that
My pleasure.
journey. Folks, we are gonna get back to our regularly scheduled programming on education, advanced transformation. And I invited Professor Colby back if you would like to come join us. Thank you so much. To go deeper into this foundation formula, we looked at language from John on Tuesday. That had us move from, that had us start our foundation formula with cost factor analysis foundation formula. And Professor Colby is here in some ways to refresh our memory on things she's previously shared with us and maybe to go a little bit deeper. Where is yours, Professor Colby?
Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Tammy Colby, for the record. And as I'll just remind everyone, I do wear different hats in the state. I am not here as a State Board of Education member this week, so nothing I say should be construed as representing in my role as State Board member. Let me pull up some slides. What I thought I might do this morning, I know you've been having a lot of discussions. Oh, it seems like I'm out of Zoom. Did it kick me out? I got in Zoom to be ready and I think I got built out. So I'm going to multitask and talk a little bit while I get Zoom.
Wait for you to get into the Zoom. It's okay. There's enough chaos today, this morning. We don't need to add.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since I've been on this committee, it's only been 3 years, but it feels like a lifetime. Listen to me though. I've come to enjoy these times
Yes.
in between witnesses when all we have to do is breathe.
No,
It's when we close all the windows we opened during the last testimony.
Yeah, true. I think it's very healthy.
Science, that's that. Every hour that you work, you need 5 hours.
Is everyone seeing my screen?
So you.
We were
5 minutes. I need. Minutes. Great.
Got it. Thank
All
you.
right, let's start this party. All right, here we go. Hey, I'm passionate about school finance, so it's gonna be great. Okay, so once again, for the record, Tammy Colby. I'm not here in my role as a member of the State Board. What I thought we might do this morning is zoom out a little bit and then zoom in. And I know that we had a couple conversations so far, one in January, another one in February, about some of the building blocks of foundation formula. What I'd like to do today is focus our discussion on 3 big questions around that policymakers need to answer if you're going to design a funding formula. And I put some tidbits in the slides that I thought these would be good places for us to start a conversation around these things. What I want to make it clear is there are design considerations, right? That means that you all have choices to make. Okay, there's not, I think in my January presentation, I said it's like apples. There are a lot of varieties of apples, but right, they're all apples, but we've got different varieties. And so if the intent is to develop a foundation formula for Vermont, it's going to be Vermont's variety foundation formula. So that means there are choices to be made. So the first thing I just want to zoom out on today is to remind ourselves that foundation formula are fundamentally student-based funding systems, okay? So right now we've got budgets and tax capacity weights. This is a shift, right? And the shift is to one where we are allocating funding based on the number of students that are either enrolled or in attendance at a district, okay? And the second thing we have to remember is that with a foundation formula, the state is effectively guaranteeing a basic spending amount or a foundation amount, right? So it's saying, here's the base, this is where we start, this is what everybody should be spending, and it's common. And then the third thing to remember about this is that districts on top of that base may receive additional funding based on certain student or school characteristics. We talked about those as cost factors, right? Those are things outside of a district's control. And we have choices to make there too, in terms of how we might make those cost adjustments, either weights or fixed per pupil grades, okay? So we're talking about student-based funding. One of the things that's unique to Vermont, and I'm gonna go right there off the bat because I know the questions are gonna come later, so we might as well talk about it right up front, is we have tuitioning towns, right? And so we need to start to rethink, rather than having tuitioning towns, we have tuitioned students, okay? So what that means is that dollars will, if we continue to move forward in places where we have tuitioning going on, either because a district doesn't operate, right, a school, or because we have sort of intra-district compacts and we have choice, those dollars will follow students. And I'm putting that out there because that has implications for how we think about weighting later on, okay? Right now, the existing system of weight is, of course, adjusts for differences in spending, right, that are in total budgets, right? And we apply our tax capacity weights. We are shifting now to student-based weights. And so we're going to have to think about that a little differently. And I put that up front, not because I'm trying to poke a political bear, but because it is something we're going to have to consider. And it's a little bit unique in terms of how we think about it here in Vermont. And I am anticipating that you will have questions about it. So I just want to level set that part of when we start to think about student-based funding is we have to start thinking about the unit being the student, not the town, right? And we have to think about how dollars are going to follow students in a choice model, right? If we are going to have a foundation amount and if we're going to have any sort of cost adjustments that go with that, okay? There are lots of questions, but I'm going to suggest that we focus on the big three to start with, because I think if we start with this big three and we start to scratch down right below into some questions, that sort of gives you a framework to work with. And these questions should sound familiar. They're questions that I brought up in my earlier testimonies. The first question is, what should that base spending amount be? Okay. 2, what cost adjustments should be incorporated in the formula? And when we're talking about costs, right, should the formula use weights? Should it use grant amounts per pupil? Or should it use both approaches, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the third thing we have to decide is what's the count of students? Like how, right? Like how are you going to count a student? So let's talk a little bit first about establishing a base spending amount. And there are 3 questions that oftentimes come up, and I think they're particularly relevant given where the discussions have been already around the foundation formula in the General Assembly and also in terms of the governor's proposal. The first one is, what should be included in a base spending amount? So a little conversation around that, I hear. Second, should the formula use a single or a variable base? And 3, how will the base spending amount be updated over time? Okay, there are other questions, but I think these are 3 big ones that get us rolling in this conversation. So what I'm going to do is I'd like to talk to you a little bit now about sort of what sort of the middle of the road is in terms of design parameters that we see in many state formula. This does not mean you have to do it this way, but I think sometimes it's good to know so where that line is so you can start to think about how that might work here, okay? So the first thing is what should be included in a base spending amount? Well, let's think about what the base is, right? If we're using a cost-based approach, which is sort of the preferred method, and that's not cost function, that's just that we're saying that we're trying to think about what it costs to achieve, right? What the level of spending should be for a particular student to buy the resources that are necessary for that student and all students to achieve common outcomes, right? In this case, right, we usually think in terms of state performance standards in ELA and math, right? So what is base spending then? That should be the amount of education spending required, right, for a student with no additional needs to attain state grade level performance standards on average. And what's included in that? That's all general education operating expenditures, because those are the things, right? Those are your payroll, your healthcare, the things that pay for the programs and services. What is not included in a base? Capital and debt service. Okay, so that's, if you have capital and debt service, that's something we have to think about, okay? 2, spending for special education programs and services or other special programs. Remember, this is for what we consider sort of a student with no additional needs, and spending for other programs funded through federal and state categorical programs. So what those dollars are, it's those operating dollars, right, that go into paying for the general education, sports and services, and that are available to every school, right? I saw a hand. Do we want to take questions as we go? I
think the hand was withdrawn.
Okay.
I promise I'll interrupt you.
Okay, please interrupt.
Can I do a clarification?
Yeah.
Yes, understand. I appreciate the attention to capital and debt service spending, and I'm trying to understand what you mean by base that's fixed versus variable. So one of the questions I've gotten is, why are we weighting facilities costs or talking about that?
Yeah.
And
Could I put that in the parking lot?
100%.
Okay.
That's a question. When you say from tax capacity to student-based waste, how the money follows the students in a choice model. What did you mean by choice model?
Well, right now in some cases we have choice, right? Where we can, for example, in the high schools, we have inter-district choice, right? Those dollars follow. We also have tuitioning models too, which essentially are sort of a voucher model. That's been in operation in Vermont for a very long time.
I just wanted to know if you're talking about a different thing.
No, I am not implying that we are moving to school choice in the state, right? But I will say that many states, 37 states who operate in, plus Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia, many of those states do have charters, right? And have choice models. So there are sort of analogs to how this works, right? In other places where there are choice models, where dollars follow students.
Thank you.
The second thing we talked about that I offered sort of as the second question was, should the formula use a single or variable base? Okay. And I want to talk about, and I'm going to say, and there's a note down here. I'm going to want to give credit to Bellwether, who has a nice website on sort of trade-offs around these things. And I adapted from some of their materials here on this because I think they did a really nice job. So a single base is just what it sounds like. The foundation amount's the same for everybody, every district. Okay, so let's make up a number. I like to deal round numbers when I'm doing things over my head. Let's say it's 10,000. Okay, so the base spending amount for every child in the state is $10,000. Okay, what's the advantage? It's transparent. Imagine going back to your constituents and explaining this to them as opposed to tax capacity debates, right? Right, it's transparent. It's straightforward to administer and update, right? But it has a limitation, right? And that limitation is it may not differentiate, it doesn't differentiate among districts based operating costs, right? That is particularly an issue in large states and also states where we have metropolitan areas where we have really significant differences in costs, right? For other reasons. So, for example, Washington State has adjustments for Seattle versus the rural areas. But that sort of tees up the next question, right? So if that's a single base, then what's a variable base? We have 2 general kinds of variable bases. One's a simple base and the other one's complex. I'm going to start with complex first and then work back. Complex is a situation where you essentially have a formula within a formula. There's a formula to create the base, and then there are weights and things that go on top of it. What's the advantage? You can recognize lots of different cost factors in your base. Like you're adjusting in your base in lots of different ways, right? Multiple ways. And you're getting to a very customized base amount. And then you're putting sort of your cost factors on, your weights on top of that. So that's a good thing. If you believe that your costs across districts are really that different, right? We might raise a question in Vermont. I don't know that would be the case here, right? But the limitation is very difficult for the public to understand. Again, you're running essentially a formula within a formula, and it also requires a lot of additional monitoring and adjustment. So I put that as the bookend. We have a single base, we have a complex variable base, but what's a simple base? A simple base is a little bit in between, which is you have multiple base amounts, but what you're doing is you're differentiating a district's base costs on a very specific set of factors. So think about sparsity, for example, right? You might differentiate the base up front just based on sparsity, right? And then you put the weights on it. So you're not calculating this complex number, right? It's right. You make the adjustment. The adjustment itself is very transparent. It's easy to understand, right? And then you make further student need adjustments on top of it.
Yeah. Question.
Yeah.
But this is just speaking to the base calculation,
We're
right? So
only on the
even in the
base.
single base, you would still have weights.
That's right. Right. All we're doing right here is we're talking about the extent to which the base is different.
So I thought just checking. Thank you.
Okay. And there are great, now, that's a great segue to sort of thinking about weights, which is great, is that we can also make similar kinds of cost adjustments through weights and fixed rate amounts, right? And that's the trade-off, right? Like, do you go with a single base and you try to make those adjustments on top of it? Or do you, right, do you have a variable base and you make fewer adjustments on top of it? In some regards,
Representative Burkhardt.
Sorry, yeah. I guess my question is, are there states that are doing these variable bases?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even the complex ones?
yes.
Okay.
So Washington State's is very complex. It's very hard to understand. And I will say, we've been doing work in Washington, and it's been really hard for legislators to manage it, right? Like, they spend a lot of time, like, really trying to get it right, really down to the penny. But it's really complex to manage. And if they don't stay on top of it, it actually creates more inequities, right? Because you've got a lot of moving pieces. I typically don't recommend a complex base, but I also I'm trying to give you all the options here, right? So you understand the trade-offs. I think that a simple variable base operates very similar to multiplicative weights, right? And in some regards, it's a little bit like what we have in Act 27 right now, where we have our long-term membership and we calculate that with grades, right? And then we put weights on top of those after we adjust for grades. There are trade-offs with this. Then the third thing is how will the base amount be updated over time? The most common approach is that we put the base spending amount is stipulated in statute along with some inflation factor, and people use different ones. I know a concern in this state right now are healthcare costs, right? And so go ahead.
Can I ask you about that? So the inflation factor that we've put into the statutory language already is sort of the most sensitive to education costs and to costs related to lots of humans.
Yep.
Lots of staffing costs. But a number of folks have brought up the concern that healthcare costs are growing well beyond the speed of any inflator index. And I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I have seen cases where you have a contingency, right? You say, we use this inflation factor unless we believe that this other inflation factor, or we have other evidence to prove or sort of suggest that that inflation factor is a lower bound to an extent. And then you sort of have a second tier, right? It's an either or. And I think that's probably a pragmatic thing. And when especially with things like healthcare costs, right? Where we, at least historically, can see that healthcare costs have risen faster than wages, right? Because most of the other, the indexes that we use are tied to wages, not to compensation.
Thanks.
And then the other thing that we most commonly,
Clarifying question. I thought when I read that sentence that you could do, for instance, a base spending amount and then something you would put in statute, like, and healthcare costs increases plus the inflation factor.
I think those are all policy options. I think the important thing to know here, right? Let's break it down into smaller pieces. You have to stipulate your base. Okay. And then most states also stipulate some way in statute for how that base will be escalated over time. I think there are different approaches to doing it, right? Some just have a neat, tidy inflation factor and off it goes. I think the thing that I've heard brought up here, and I think you're also getting at is that just having a typical inflation like a CPI or an NI or something like that may be insufficient to cover the more rapidly escalating, right, inflation and healthcare costs. And so that would certainly be something that in policy you would need to attend to if you thought that was a concern. But you have to think about it as two parts. You need a base and you got to figure out how you're going to escalate the base. And there are options within your approach to escalate the base. Okay. The other thing is that we generally see a requirement in statute to evaluate the formula using some established school finance methods every 4 to 5 years, right? So if you think about it, you establish a base based on what we know about educational practices now, right? We inflate that right? We have some sort of inflation factor, but education changes, cost structures change, governance changes. There are lots of things that change. And so you need to go back and reevaluate whether or not the base is still spot on, right? Every 4 or 5 years is usually the recommendation.
Do they ever also tie it to other legislative changes that would affect the base? I mean, we pass legislation every year that affects the cost of education. And so if your base is based on assumptions about what we're requiring districts to do, how do you make sure that we don't impose changes in practice that affect the viability of the base?
Typically what we see in other states is it isn't in statute. There isn't like there isn't like something that tripwires it. However, I think usually when legislatures recognize that they're instituting some sort of systemic change that might change the cost structure, right, of education, then there's that triggers a cost study.
And how do you handle the inverse, which is when, for example, we've been level funding the Department of Mental Health for decades, it feels like, and that cost is shifting into the ed fund. How do you account in your foundation formula for cost shifts?
Would that be picked up in the recalculation?
That should be picked up in the recalibration, right? Because the spending number, your base reflects operating expenditures.
But if it's 5 years, and we cut Medicaid, we're 5 years out,
So-
we could have substantial financial shifts.
I don't, so let me back up. The general recommendation is to update your formula as a matter of course and have it in statute that at least every 4 to 5 years, you're running a cost study to make sure. Now, if Vermont decides to do big changes, which may happen, right? Then there's good reason to believe that 4 to 5 years would be too long, right? And we talked about when I was here in January, if we also know that there's going to be some systemic changes to governance, right? Like there's ways to take your base and actually start to think about how you step into some other number based on anticipated cost savings, for example, right? Or if you're going to shift costs around, you could also have a step into costs going up, right? So what would happen if we shifted pension costs back to the districts, right? Well, we would need to adjust that. What it means though is that it is incumbent on the legislature, right, to be thinking about those things, right, going forward. Because right now what we have is with our system, everybody just passes their budgets, right, and they pay the bills, and then we figure out the tax capacity weights. This changes the game, right? So it has to change sort of the policymaking frameworks that you all are using going forward, and to be disciplined about the fact that if you're making these changes, and they have predictable effects on a base, up or down, right? Then you're gonna have to actually take care of the base.
Aside from just general best management practices, is it advisable that you put in statute that any substantial changes to funding or spending at the school level have to kick off a review of the base?
You know, I have not seen that other places. That doesn't mean they haven't done it. I just don't remember seeing it in other statute. It seems like a prudent thing to do. I don't see a reason not to do it, I guess. You know, I would certainly take testimony from others on that. I mean, that's more an opinion of mine, but it certainly seems like a reasonable thing to do. And especially in the environment we have right now, where there likely will be changes coming. Look, there may be other kinds of policy shifts going over time.
Yeah. Thank you for all this. I look like I'm asleep, but I'm not. That's not my face.
I know, I'm sorry.
That's all right. These are all useful ways of approaching an answer. And I think I go back to Representative Holton's question about mental health as an example. Sooner or later, we have to pick a methodology. Where I'm getting down to, and we do the best we can and we go with it. I'm recognizing that within year 1 and year 5, there are going to be variations that we're going to have to live with. And some of them may make us very uncomfortable. And I don't know how to get around that question. I mean, we have to pick a methodology and try to work with it. There's no easy way, I think. And this is sort of a roundabout comment. Thank you for providing several different options on how we get to this. And none of them are going to satisfy everybody. I think that's where we end up. And we'll just have to live with our system. And
I think what I'm trying to do is pose the questions that you need to ask and answer. And I'm trying to do my best to give you sort of what are some options that you can consider. But that doesn't mean you have to consider just these options, right? You know, I'm hopeful that I can give you a starting point for discussion.
You're being clear. I'm not.
You're being very clear. This isn't easy stuff, right? You know, I mean, for what it's worth, you know, this is all I've done for 25 years, right? Right? This kind of stuff. So, you know, I can't do what half of you do. So there you go.
Restate what I was saying yesterday, which is obvious to some people, when we changed from total budgets, which is last week, shall we say, to foundation formula. There's certain advantages, and I think you're presenting them well, and we recognize that. But there are going to be a host of questions, primarily that are going to come from school districts.
Yes.
Which may sound like, what are you doing? But thank you. I'm on a tangent, but I think you understand why.
Change is hard.
Thank you.
Change is hard, and change when it comes to school finance is particularly hard.
When it all boils down to money.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sorry, you're not Representative Colby, you're Dr. Colby. So you're welcome to run for office anytime.
I've seen what y'all do. Okay, so we've talked about the base. Okay, now I want to talk about cost adjustment. And again, what I'm trying to do is lay the land, and then I know we're having questions back and forth now, but I'm hoping we'll leave lots of time for more questions. So the second thing, right? So once we have a base, we figured all that out. Now we've got to figure out, do you adjust, right? And how you adjust. And what I will say is that there's no foundation formula in the country that does not include cost adjustments. And there are good reasons for that, right? Like, because we already talked about all those kinds of reasons that there are circumstances outside district control, right? That would cause for variation in cost to that base. And if we don't have cost adjustments, then we effectively make an inequitable school funding system, because then those costs are borne, right? We have differences in costs that are borne differently by districts. Broadly, we think of costs in the field, right? Cost adjustments falling into 4 big buckets, okay? The first one are individual student risk or need factors, right? And we think about this as disability status, right? English language learners. We can also talk about students who experience economic disadvantage, right? We also have the social context of schools. And what is that? Sometimes states consider concentrations, right, of students who are economically disadvantaged or concentrations of students who are on average higher need. Because the actual context of the school, once you sort of hit a tipping point, it's very different, right? Another one is scale and sparsity. We already adjust for that in our formula, right? District enrollment, district school enrollment, grade level, population sparsity, and rurality. And then the fourth one is input prices. Let me just, and the other one is input prices, and that's geographic differences in input prices. Some states have wide variations, particularly with respect to personnel costs, right, across districts. And so those variations in input prices are outside of district control because just of the cost of living. What I will say, though, is that we have to be really careful around geographic variation in input prices and adjustments for cost of living, particularly with teacher salaries in funding formula, because what can happen, and we've seen this happen in other states, is we adjust for that. And what that does is we basically sort of reify the fact that some districts can pay more than others. Right. And in small states like this, where we do have geographic differences in costs, but they're not substantial, right? There may be other ways to manage that other than sort of overt adjustments in the formula. For example, having a statewide a single salary schedule for teachers in the state, right? Could be another way to handle that. Okay.
Representative Holcomb?
Talk about the difference between enrollment size and district size, ADM.
Average daily membership, you're talking about what the difference between enrollment and average daily.
Here you're talking about weighting based on school enrollment. You're not based on district size. There's a difference.
It's district and school enrollment size, and some places use ADM and some places use enrollment.
So I guess my question is, why are we weighting districts that don't operate schools as if they were operating?
I think that's a policy decision. Right? I think the challenge is, so we wrote a memo last spring, I think it was to this committee in JFO, that talked about sort of what the assumptions were in our weighting that we have right now, right? And this will come back to the student-centered weights, which is back to the student-centered weights, which is if in fact we have a scenario where the tuition amount doesn't vary on student characteristics, and I'm just going to stick with student characteristics for a minute, and then I'll go to size, right? The purpose of the weights are adjust for costs, right? And so if I'm charging the same amount per student, then there's nothing to adjust, right? The same goes for tuitioning, right? That where I may be in a small town, right? Or a rural area, the place where the kid lives. However, where they go to school is someplace different. And this is something that if you move to a foundation-based formula, this is why I sort of preempted, said like, this is going to be something that's a little bit unique to Vermont and that we're going to have to think about. So one way you might manage that is to say, here's the foundation amount, right? And that's equal to your tuition amount. And and then there would be additional spending that would be sort of additional tuition amounts on top of that would correspond to student need factors that then would weight, right? But to your point, we wrote in our memo to last spring around weighting, right? A weighting is supposed to adjust for differences in costs. And when the tuition is all the same, there's no cost to adjust for, right? Not to mention that our study didn't include tuition in towns because there's no outcomes you can't do that with the data. But just conceptually, you wouldn't do that. Now, if tuition varied, right, according to differences in student need, then there might be an argument to weight the students. Does that answer your question?
Is yours a follow-up? It's a follow-up. Okay, and I know Representative Brannigan has a question. I also want to make sure that we're I think you've sort of set up a path for us to try to understand something, and I'm worried that with too many questions, we're gonna lose the thread.
Can I just?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just.
Because this is, I think this is going to the heart of some of the challenge that we have right now. And I'm not gonna use district names, but because I think how we weight is gonna influence decision-making. And so we have to be thinking not just of where we are, but where we want to go. And so there is a town, for example, that chose to unmerge from a larger district. When it was a larger district, it was not weighted for size. Because it is now unmerged, it is weighted as if it's very small. And not just for the elementary small school that it now has, but also for the high school where it used to not be weighted. Now it's weighted as if it was operating a small high school because it's a small tuition district at the secondary level. And that means it got, its poverty level is a little lower than the district it withdrew from, but it is getting significant subsidy for being small now. And it's sending its kids to 2 public schools that are farther away now, to a brand new micro private school that only had 8 kids, which seems to, would we be enrolling them for enrollment in that very small private school of only 8 kids now, because that's a choice a bunch of kids made. And we're also sending to 2 much farther away private schools, including a religious school. So we're actually rewarding them for making choices about small financially, even as their choice to pull out of their origin district has significantly increased the per pupil cost in that origin district, including for everybody across the state, because we all subsidize it. So how do we manage this without perversely rewarding people for eroding scale?
So let's sort of unwind that in a couple of ways. First of all, money's the means of the ends, right? Like we want a finance system that aligns with our other policy goals. And so if our policy goal is to make sure that we are not operating small schools of choice as opposed to small schools by necessity, then we have to think about what we're doing in terms of our weighting for small schools and sparsity, right? Current policy right now does that. This certainly would be, and I'll talk about this in a couple of minutes, right? Like when you make choices about your cost factor, this is something you're going to have to make a choice about, right? There are a number of options for how you could do that. And again, these are options. These are not policy proposals by Tammy, okay? Right, like you certainly could continue with weighting, right, in the foundation formula, right? And I think there are weights on the table that I've seen that have been proposed by the governor's office for small and sparse that build on the existing weights that we have right now. So that's one option. Another option would be to go to some sort of variable base, right? Another option would be to move to a categorical grant program, like what we used to have in terms of a small school program, right? And you could put existing guardrails, additional guardrails around that allowed for a greater degree of control over and sort of oversight over the extent to which those dollars were going to small schools and schools in sparsely populated areas by choice versus need, right? Those are all fair game. Okay, all of those things. And so if those are concerns that you have, these are concerns that there are ways that this could be managed in a future foundation formula, but those are really policy decisions. And I'm not going to necessarily recommend one way. Those are 3, there may be more options. Those are 3 that comes off the top of my head.
And I think as we get the bill from education, then we can understand what the policy choices they're making with regards to small schools and scale. We'll have a better sense of what the right policy direction is to take on how we're supporting that with our fiscal policy. You're good? Okay.
But the point I want to make here is, is that with these different buckets, is that there's a range of cost factors out there. However, the cost factors differ by state. So just because it's a cost factor in New York or Washington or Maryland or wherever, doesn't mean it's a cost factor here. Right? It also means that the magnitude of the cost difference is differed by state. So it should not be the case that you make decisions about what cost factors you incorporate into your formula based on what other states do. The cost factors that you incorporate in your formula need to be based on empirical methods that determine what the cost differences are here in Vermont. And then you adjust for those differences. These are all possible cost factors. But in the 2019 weighting study, we didn't find that we had all these cost factors. Like not all of these things accounted for differences in costs in Vermont. Okay, so I just want to make sure that everybody's clear about, there's a range of cost factors that you can adjust for in a foundation formula. The cost factors that you might put in a formula differ by state, as does the magnitude of the adjustment, and that you need a Vermont-specific approach, right? You need to understand what are the cost differences in Vermont and how large they are when you make a decision about cost factors for your foundation work. Okay. Okay, what do we have now? We've got student economic disadvantage. It's a weight. English language learner is a single weight. We run a categorical grant program for special education. I think in my February testimony, I suggested that likely would be, there'd be some policy incoherence between the existing categorical grant program, state categorical grant program for special education, and a foundation formula. We also have district context weights and grade range, school enrollment, population density, and transportation. All of these cost factors that are in our current formula were identified using empirical methods that were specific to Vermont. Okay.
Do you recommend, earlier you spoke about looking at the base calculations every 4 to 5 years? Do you also recommend looking at what we are using for cost adjustments?
Yes. So cost study does both those things happen at the same time. And the great question. And going back to what I talked about in January, remember that your weights are all relative to a base. So if you don't do a holistic cost study that looks at your base and the cost factors, right? Your weights and base don't work together anymore. Okay. And we see weights change over time. And that could be due to policy choices that we make, conditions on the ground, et cetera. And we also see cost factors change. Okay, last slide. What student count should be used to calculate a district's membership in the formula? It's a student-based funding formula. So you have one of the big decisions is how you're going to count students. Right now, our current formula uses an average 2-year enrollment, right? But other states use average daily membership, and some states use most recent years. There are pros and cons to all of these approaches, but it's a decision that you need to make. So let me stop there. I hope that's helpful. I thought maybe just giving some big questions to start with, and then we can open the floor for more discussion and questions that you may have.
So Professor Colby, when you worked on Act 127, I noted that one big segment from your slide about different potential weights or cost factors, there isn't an adjustment for input prices. And was that found that there wasn't a big difference in input prices?
We did not find a difference a significant difference in input prices. We did not find that input prices was a statistically significant cost factor in Vermont.
Even with regard to wages?
No.
How can that be? Sorry.
One question.
Yeah, and then my other question was, one thing I didn't see in the input prices is sort of building maintenance. So there is definitely a variation across districts about how well buildings have been kept up and how much folks are spending on that every year. And it can take a really big chunk out of the budget. So was that thought about in the 127 weights, or is that a cost?
The 127 weights were tax capacity rates, right? And so that takes actual budgets and recalibrates budgets. So for a foundation formula weights, building maintenance would not be in the weight, right? It would be in the base. Weights adjust for differences in student need or context, those cost factors, right? And so one of the things we have to think about in your base is the extent to which right? So that would be part of your general operating spending, right? Because that's part of sort of operating a school. Investments in specific capital projects and debt service typically is not. That's outside sort of operating expenditures. So facilities maintenance is in the base. Now, there is variability across Vermont. And I think one of the things you're highlighting here, though, is as we transition from a system where every school district creates its own budget, it's creating its own, right? It's made decisions about buildings and construction and all these things. And we sort of have the hodgepodge, right, of spending around that. It's not very even. We probably will need to think of some sort of glide path or transition plan for those kinds of things that we can standardize spending across districts and schools with respect to maintenance facilities. But my understanding is there's a separate group that's working on thinking about school construction and facilities and things along those lines. And it may be many states handle sort of school facilities and construction and facilities through a separate funding mechanism for exactly those reasons, right? Like it's hard to hold a district accountable for a base spending amount when you have wide variations in not just the extent of maintenance of facilities, but sort of size of campuses and things along those lines. And so oftentimes that's handled outside the base through a separate funding mechanism.
Representative Mather?
Could you repeat that again about funding mechanisms outside the base?
Right. So
Try to follow that.
So if we have a foundation formula, right, and we have our base operating spending amount, and that's what on average it costs for a student, right?
Got that.
And then we compare, and then we adjust on top of that for the cost of educating students,
Got it? So far.
right? And those cost adjustments can be through weights or they can be through categorical rent. Right?
Right.
We also have other kinds of education costs, right? That are related to facilities and construction and things along those lines. That's not operating expenditures.
Okay, that's.
Right? And typically that's handled through a different funding mechanism because the base is your operating.
Okay.
And there's wide variation across districts in terms of facilities and maintenance and things along those lines. And it would be inequitable and also very difficult to do to come up with a base amount, right? And cost adjustments that fully account for that level of variation.
It sounds almost, we're, trying to stay away from formula within a formula.
I agree.
We're kind of wandering close to that line, are we not?
I don't think so. I think that if you have a relatively straightforward foundation formula that's squarely focused on operating costs, where you have a base, either a single base or a simple variable base, and you have cost adjustments that go on top of that or needs based in context, right? That's actually a pretty straightforward, like I can almost do that math here with my pink pen.
Gotcha.
Right? But then I think we have a second set of questions here, which is how do we handle facilities and maintenance and construction?
Okay.
And that's non-operating dollars. And typically, because those things are so variable across districts and the needs are so variable across districts, it's really difficult to create a base amount that would capture that. And also, what we're doing in the base is that's a student-based number, right? Student-centered number, as opposed this would be sort of a facilities or a district-based number.
Great.
Yeah, Representative Feltes.
So why is special education and other programs not included part of the operating expenses of a school?
Because those things, we adjust for those things in terms of the cost adjustments. Remember that the base is for a student with no additional needs, right? And so those additional costs that are for a student receiving special education would go in the special education rate. Ask a follow-up question.
Well,
You still have a fro breath, so I feel like I didn't answer it.
Well, when we go back and say student with no additional needs, I understand that. I'm just thinking it's in terms of its operating expenses of school, you are offering the academic requirements to adjust for the students that need special education and whatever other state categorical programs there are. It's part of the regular operation of the school.
So in your base, we have the costs of the general education curriculum. We also have the district administrative costs. Okay. And those district administrative costs cover the cost of operating special programs. What the weight or the cost adjustment does is it talks about the additional costs of educating Tammy above and beyond the base. And I cost a lot. Right. But so what that is that says, and I can pull up my slides from the special education slides. It says Tammy on average costs in addition, her special education services, the things that are on my IEP cost on average $11,000 more over the base. But in that base, right, because we're talking about the general operating costs of the district, we would have the special education director, right? All of those things are in your base.
Can you talk from when you describe the base, you're talking about costs. And would love to go a little deeper into how those costs are calculated, because when we've looked at sort of an evidence-based base, we spent a lot of time talking about like how all of these sort of costs added up in a linear way and then were averaged. And we got very caught up in like what's left out or not left out.
Right.
And then the cost factor base, I feel like you don't wind up with quite those same problems. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so if we want to go back to the first presentation I made, I gave that table in the back that sort of did a comparison, right? And let me say they all have their strengths and weaknesses, okay? So one of the strengths of the evidence-based approach is that you identify all these best practices and you cost them out and you add them up and you say, oh, they're all in a school. Well, one of the weaknesses of an evidence-based approach is that you may not get everything by adding up all those things together. You might miss administration, right? Like it's a little unclear. The other thing is that it isn't the case that there's no school that operates with all those things in there, right? So you also don't know, you could easily underestimate, you also could easily overestimate, right? That's strengths and weaknesses, okay? With a professional judgment approach, which has not been done here recently, a professional judgment approach is a little like an evidence-based approach, but right, it talks to teachers and you then get, you are, in doing so, you're talking about these tangible resources it needs to operate in an existing school, okay? Rather than this sort of pile-on of best practices. It has the trade-offs of, on the positive side, right? You're talking about experienced educators and what it takes to educate to operate a school. And so you're more likely to get all those pieces and parts than if you stack it all up. The weakness is that educators oftentimes will talk about what they know as best practices based on their experience, and it might not be evident, it might not be contemporary evidence. Cost function approach takes actual spending, right? And it's the total dollars spent, and it models the relationship between spending and outcomes. And it says, this is the optimal level of spending to get these outcomes. And it's taking total spend, right? So it's not saying, oh, we spent it on this, this, and this. And so it solves a little bit of the problem you're saying. But when you pull out of that, just the additional, but you're trying to get the spending, the general operating spending. So you pull out of that the additional dollars spent for students to provide special education services, because that would not be, right? It allows you to be more precise in pulling out those kinds of spendings, but it also allows you to be more inclusive in getting the total operating spending that districts are actually expending. And then what you're doing in a quite a precise way is you're looking at, okay, what is the most efficient level of spending to get outcomes based on existing spending patterns in a state? So it takes into account your governance, right? It takes into account all of those things, right? So that's a strength, right? Because for one, you get your arms around everything and you're able to cordon off the things you don't want in terms of spending, right? And remember, when we're setting a base amount, we're trying to say a base spending amount. So you've got, right, correspondence there. The weakness of a cost function approach is that you've lumped all the spending together and you've done the statistical model, but you don't have that additional information that you get with, for example, with a PJP or an evidence-based approach where you can say, this is how the dollars were spent. What you're using are your accounting systems. And it just says, these are the dollars are spent. And we can tell how they're spent based on accounting codes, but not programmatically. Okay, which is why most often we pair, when we do sort of cost function research, like what we just did in Colorado, most of the work when we do cost function modeling, we pair it with PJPs. And I think that was in my slides before. But what we've found is usually the numbers actually come out pretty close to one another. That's a good thing, right? Like in theory, if all three of these approaches are doing their job, the numbers should be pretty similar, right? The question is the question you have to ask is if they're different from one another, why are they different? Okay. And so most sort of, I would say, high quality school finance studies usually use at least two methods, right? And that's good science, right? So you would expect that the evidence-based approach and a professional judgment approach, those things should come out, right? Like if the teachers are thinking about best practices, right? Those numbers should come out pretty close to this, right? And if the evidence-based approach is doing a good job of getting all those administrative costs and picking that stuff up, then it should look pretty much like this. Same thing with the cost modeling, right? If the function, right, if the statistics are working well and you're doing this outcomes, this should look pretty similar to the what you're coming out of PJP. I can say that in the most recent study we did in Colorado, the PJP estimates and the cost function estimates lined up nicely. So is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
But I want to be transparent. There are different methods. Different people use different methods. It's a thing, right? What I will tell you is they all have trade-offs. There's no such thing as perfection here, right? And so what we want to do is that's why I always suggest that we try to use more than one method. But I think in terms of if you're interested in just getting to a base spending amount, the education cost function approach will get you a pretty tight base spending amount and your weights estimated well. What it will not tell you is exactly how those dollars are spent programmatically.
Okay, we need to wrap, so you got the last word.
Oh, thank you. I am so grateful to you for your clarity, but also for not telling us what to do, but helping us understand the questions.
Right.
And in that vein, you also mentioned that sometimes we adjust what we put in the foundation and what we weight. And I think we have been struggling with the fact that we seem to have some challenges around special education, and maybe we need to get ahead of what's going on with special ed and what the drivers are.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to ask you to tell us what to do, but could you tell us what questions we need to be asking and what we need to understand in order to get a handle on special ed and think about how we might move towards weighting for special ed if we chose to do that?
So
That makes sense.
say get a handle on special ed.
Well, I'm listening to extraordinary.
Yeah.
I forget about, I know it's too big. What are the questions that we should be asking? Just keep it simple.
So what would an efficient and fair special education funding system look like?
Right.
Okay. I think may I rephrase the question that way?
100%.
Okay. So what would efficient and fair, and this is something I've spent a lot of time on because I run the national study for this, for the feds. Right, so an efficient and fair special education funding system looks like any other good cost adjustment, right? So what it recognizes is that the special education spending is that additional spending, right, to implement a child's IEP. And we know that there's a federal share to that, a state share to that, and a local share to that. So after you take off the federal share, we think we're going to have a federal share. Another day. But if you take off the federal share, right, then the next question is how do you split the state and local share fairly? Okay. Well, part of making that decision is you have to understand and make sure that your cost adjustment, right, takes into account the fact that you're going to have a wide variation in costs, right? So a student who has significant impairments due to, or significant needs due to their autism spectrum disorder, on average may cost $50,000 to $60,000 additional a year. A student who has a mild speech and language impairment, especially at the secondary level, may cost another $5,000 a year. So to adjust for that, right, we need to think about how do we drive additional dollars to, again, we're student-based. How do we drive additional more dollars to offset the costs for the student with autism spectrum disorder versus fewer dollars to the student who has a mild speech and language impairment? How most states have evolved to doing this within the context of a foundation form, right? is they've moved to a system of multiple weights, right? Where the weights, where the cost adjustment, the weight gets bigger, right? For students with higher levels of need, and it is smaller for students with lower levels of need. Now, where this gets really, where a key design consideration then, we put it this way, is how do you come up with a straightforward way of identifying differences in student need in the context of a formula? What do I mean by that? So we used to have this, many states used to tie this to disability categories, saying disability category is a good proxy for need. And so the weights would be bigger, right, for students in certain disability categories and smaller for other students, right, in other disability categories. What we now know is that disability category is not a great proxy for need. It's also not a great, so think about it this way. If you have a student with an autism spectrum disorder who is low need, high function, that student may actually cost the same. The additional spending for that student might actually be very similar to the spending for a student who has significant emotional behavioral challenges, right? On average, perhaps the average spending amount for a student with an emotional behavioral challenge is lower, right? And on average, the spending for a student with an autism spectrum disorder is higher, but there's a lot of overlap. The spending, right? So disability category is not a great proxy for need. And so states have started to migrate to more need-based groupings of students. Sometimes they correspond with disability category. Why disability category? Because it's data that we collect on students. It's easy to categorize. We got to think about that. But, you know, places like Florida now use a matrix, a need-based matrix that they fill out, and that helps. Like, there are different ways of doing this, right? But the key takeaway here is that the block grant system that we have right now will not integrate very well with a foundation formula for a lot of reasons, right? And so the trick will be, right, for policymakers is to figure out, well, okay, so then how do we sort of fold in special education as a cost adjustment within a foundation formula? And the predominant approach of doing that is weights, right? And some states use a single weight, but the research that we've done shows that that's highly inefficient and inequitable because the number is always wrong, right? You never get it right because there's so much variation. And so states are migrating toward multiple weights, and there are different ways of doing multiple weights. And if that's of interest to you, I have got a brief on that. I can talk to you about the different ways that states do.
Send that to us. That'd be great. I'm sure we're interested.
We just did a whole study on this for Oregon.
Can I just ask one clarification question? Because I'm gonna have to do something on this. Is there a minimum governance side? I mean, I think the power of the census block was that if you have a large enough block, there's some sort of insurance system. I mean, I remember being in a very small district. We had three very expensive students move in, and it blew our budget. If you're a big enough unit, it's sort of the risk is shared.
Yeah.
And, you know, we've talked about BOCES, nothing's gotten off the ground, but is there a statistically relevant size at which you begin to reduce the risk of local variation?
Yeah.
Because students aren't actually evenly distributed across the state.
No, they're not.
Students' families target certain districts
No, they're
for
not.
reasons. There
They're
are
not.
reasons.
So a couple things. First, that's why most states operate a high-cost kid reimbursement program. We operate one. It seems to be operating at a very expensive level right now. I would be curious to understand more about that. I don't have the data to understand that, other than I see the spending, and that spending looks very different than what we see in other states. So something is happening.
Bonkers, I think was your technical.
Bonkers, that was my technical. So most states have a high cost kid program, and under which is sort of the insurance policy to districts because it is outside their control. And you can use up to 10% of your IDA funding to seed that, right? So you have to follow the Fed's rules on how to set that up and what your thresholds are. The other way to think about this, right, is you got to get your weights right, right? And so if you have student, right, like we're moving to a student-based funding formula, right? And so the census block grant program now is all about sort of thinking about how to distribute costs within budgets. What we're talking about now is we're talking about student-based funding. And so if the weights aren't right, then places who, districts who have on average greater concentrations of need with respect to students receiving special education will have to come up with a larger share of local tax dollars to offset the cost of special education. And that's called encroachment. I don't like that term because it feels like I'm pitting kids against kids. But, you know, if your pie is fixed and you can't raise more dollars, then your pie is fixed, right? And the dollars come from somewhere. And so that's why it's really important under a foundation formula to make sure that those cost adjustments, usually in the form of weights, are well calibrated to the additional, to offsetting the additional spending, and also being clear about making sure those weights are tied to key student characteristics that explain variability in spending. It was a long-winded answer to a short question. Did that help?
Forward to your brace.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Colby. We are taking a 15-minute break. Okay, I want to say something to the committee, and it may help you too,
Okay.
or indirectly. There's a lot of content to what you're telling us. Some of it's fairly complex, but well thought out and well delivered. Under circumstances like this, I'm primarily an auditory learner. So if I appear to be staring around the room, I mean, just, you know, lost in space somewhere, actually, that's the way I'm learning best to what you say. So I just want y'all to understand what's going on here. Good. And we're